Hello, everyone. My name's Tod Brody. I'm the Executive Director of the Marin Symphony, and I'm here to welcome you to this week's conversation from the Marin Symphony. The reason that I am here hosting today instead of your usual host is that my guest is that usual host, our music director, Maestro Alasdair Neale. Hello, Alasdair. How are you today?
Hi, Tod. Hi, good to see you. Yes, I'm very well. Looking forward to chatting with you.
Well, we thought about our series, and next week we will be getting back to our conversations with Marin Symphony musicians. The whole focus of this series has been to help you get to know the organization better, and a lot of that's taken the form of getting to know our people better. But we thought it would be interesting this week to focus on what goes into making a Marin Symphony season, and in particular our Masterworks season, which Alasdair, particularly with a little assist from me, is working on planning for starting next fall. So Alasdair, maybe you could just talk generally about the kinds of considerations that go into preparing a season. Maybe I'll start out by asking you if there's any one element that rises above the others that seems the most important, or is it a whole balancing act of many different elements?
I think more the latter. It is a balancing act, and in some ways I liken it to being a kind of a chef owner. I mean, yes, I'm in the kitchen, but I also am responsible for selecting the menu. And in that regard, I have to give a great deal of thought to various elements of balance and various interests, sometimes competing, that always come into play when you're dealing with a multi-concert series. And so I generally start out from the position of anchoring a season with a few givens. Like, for instance, we always have a concert, usually almost always in the spring, with the chorus. And so I need to figure that out. And that usually anchors a program. I have to think about guest artists and availability. And then some of the very big pieces that we would do that would form the second half of a program, and see how they fit into an overall picture. So first of all, I have to look at those kind of things and see what the overall flavor of a season is. But I also have to make sure that each individual concert on its own makes sense, that it makes sense from a musical perspective, that it makes sense from a rehearsal perspective, which is to say that the orchestra will be able to rehearse it in our normal time period, so that it doesn't end up being, let's say, 4 ridiculously hard and complex works. I also have to keep my feet on the ground, and you, of course, are a good partner in that, because we also have to be fiscally responsible, right? You have a budget to work with, and I rely on you to make sure that I'm coloring within the lines.
Well, many of these elements have a fiscal or a budgetary part to them, so we'll talk about that as we go forward. But just thinking about a season overall, why don't you tell the folks about some of the elements that go into that balancing act, the sorts of things that you're considering to make what feels like a well-balanced menu for your kitchen?
Sure. So you could have, let's say, in theory, a season that would consist of Tchaikovsky Symphony on first concert, a Rachmaninoff Symphony on the second concert, a Stravinsky ballet on the third concert, and help me out here, maybe another Tchaikovsky Symphony on the last concert. And those are, you could get some really exciting programs to build around that. But if you don't like Russian music particularly, then you're kind of out of luck for that season. And that's a season that will be very, very heavily geared towards one particular part of the repertoire. So part of my job is to make sure that we have various nationalities reflected, and that we have various periods in history reflected as well, not just romantic war horses, but dealing earlier with some works from the earlier Viennese classics like Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven, as well as French music, or sometimes English, and of course American, particularly contemporary American, to which I feel a strong commitment and tie.
Sure. So let's talk a little bit about that last thing you mentioned, American music, thinking about contemporary music. Where does that fit into the overall mix for an organization like the Marin Symphony?
It's a very important part, as anybody that has some working knowledge of the Marin Symphony's history can attest to. We've been part of a number of commissioning projects over the years, and whether it's in the form of a commission and a first performance, or a work that has been performed before but isn't necessarily what we would call part of the standard repertoire. It's important to me to be able to present music that is unfamiliar. To me, part of the balanced diet means not just serving dishes that everybody's had before,
Sure.
but trying to perhaps, by thoughtful programming, set up a situation where you're setting the dish that you're familiar with in a new light by pairing it alongside something that is different, but maybe has some elements in common, but the two can illuminate each other, if that makes sense.
That does. And then on the other side of that coin, well, one thing I'll share with our audience is that Alasdair has a, to me, remarkable memory of the works that he's conducted both here and elsewhere, and when that was. So we'll talk about, well, what about Prokofiev's second violin concerto? And he'll say, oh yeah, we did that in 2006 with such and such soloist or whatever.
It was with
No,
it was with Chi-Yun, and I think it was probably around 2004. But,
well, there you go. Okay,
I could be wrong.
You've made my point, and that being the case, so when we're talking about maybe more familiar works or works that will come back on some kind of regular basis, do you have any rule of thumb or principles that you apply for how long does it have to be since we did Beethoven 7 before that's fair game to do that again, that kind of thing?
I mean, there's a rule of thumb, but it's a fairly flexible one, and with certain works in the repertoire, there's more, that flexibility is greater than others. A piece like Beethoven 5 comes up more frequently than most others in the repertoire, but on the other hand, I also wouldn't want to do it more than every, let's say at the minimum, 3 years. In part because we do just 4 Masterworks concerts. If we were a season that had 30 Masterworks programs, then that might be a little bit different, because you would, from a marketing standpoint, you would vary the silo that particular work would fall in. But for an orchestra of our size and scope, I would say that there's a limit to how often we do pieces. Because we want, part of the reason is there's so much great music out there. I mean, I love Beethoven 5 as much as the next person, but there are 8 other Beethoven symphonies and 104 Haydn symphonies and 41 Mozart symphonies and 9 Schubert symphonies, and that takes us up to 1831. There's quite a lot of other symphonies written after that as well. So you get my point. We've got so much to choose from.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you ever get to the point with a work, I don't know if Beethoven 5 is a good example, but I know I do, where my exposure to that piece has been so frequent that it feels like it's lost its impact for me, and I feel like I want to give it a rest just so that I can have a little bit more freshness to the experience when I do eventually come back to it?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there are a certain number of pieces. I mean, I would say probably a piece like Pictures at an Exhibition, which I like a lot. I think it would be perfectly fine if I didn't conduct it for the next 5 or 6 years. Another piece, though, that from a different vantage point is something like it would be the Pathétique Symphony of Tchaikovsky, which I purposefully don't program under any circumstances for myself more than once every 3 years, regardless of which orchestra it's with, because that's a piece that kind of it feels like when I do it, it makes me, it kind of destroys me, and it's like getting a blow to the solar plexus. I mean, the emotional cataclysm that that piece is something that just profoundly affects me. And I never, ever want to feel like it's something, oh, here we trot out that piece again. It needs to be very, very special.
Sure.
So I make a conscious decision to just visit that occasionally, so that I never forget the visit.
So talking about balancing repertoire and these various things that go into that, there's been a lot of attention, happily, I think, paid in recent years, especially to symphony orchestras working to create diversity in gender, ethnic diversity, to bring pieces into the repertoire or into their audience's ears that come from groups that have been underrepresented for a very long time. Wondering if you could talk about how that fits into your thinking, and maybe a little bit about what we've been trying to do here at the Marin Symphony in that arena.
Sure. I mean, it is with good reason a topic that has long overdue come to the forefront, and I will say that it's been a journey of discovery for me, a journey I feel if I had the chance to do over again in the largest scheme of my life, I would have made some different decisions and different levels of curiosity over the years. So those issues are definitely things that figure more prominently in my imagination than they ever have in the past, and those journeys that I'm making and exploring some repertoire that has been overlooked in the past have been really interesting. I'm starting to acquaint myself with pieces that I simply didn't know before, and I think deserve a platform, deserve a spotlight. So you can expect more of that in coming seasons at the Marin Symphony for sure.
Great. I'm so happy to hear about that and to be part of that. Let's talk a little bit about soloists. So, there are a lot of amazing soloists in our world, and just wondering if you can talk about the things that go into deciding which soloists to feature with the Marin Symphony.
One of the things I love about conducting is accompanying. I have had the pleasure and privilege of working with some of the most distinguished soloists in the world. And I just love the collaborative process in general. And there's nothing that exemplifies that more than a concerto. So choosing soloists is always a delight. It's also a challenge because there are so many musicians out there on the soloist circuit that I love working with, and many of whom I've formed long-term musical relationships now over the years. And I've had the pleasure of introducing to Marin audiences. At the same time, I think it's also important not just to recycle one's friends, but to make new friends. And in the same vein, to bring new soloists to Marin. While it would be very easy for me to have a stable of revolving soloists that we brought in year after year, and very satisfying in a way for me to continue those relationships, I'm also conscious of the need for variety and introducing some new and young faces, which leads me to think what a pleasure it was to bring in one of the newest and exciting faces a couple of years ago, the cellist Oliver Herbert, to play a memorable performance of the Elgar cello concerto, which he did at the age of 21 or 22, I think, and was his first time ever playing that piece.
First of a great many times, I would expect.
Absolutely. And the first of what I will be certain to say will be a number of appearances with the Marin Symphony. Somebody that I would absolutely would love to have back.
Well, one of the things I say, sometimes somewhat facetiously, but not so much, is that when we have access to a soloist like young Oliver Herbert, whom you've known, throughout much of his childhood, as well as, through his development as a mature artist, that we have the opportunity to bring him here while he's still in our price range. And thanks to the relationship that you have with him, I have a commitment from young Mr. Herbert to come back to the Marin Symphony, maybe even when his price range has exceeded our normal budget. So that's one of those budgetary considerations that we alluded to earlier. One other area that I thought people might be interested in hearing about is when we're talking about balancing a season, that we have an obligation to our musicians to employ them at a certain level. I mean, it's outlined in a collective bargaining agreement, and it's a moral obligation as well as a legal obligation, as far as I'm concerned, and you too, I believe. And maybe you could just talk a little bit about how that plays into shaping a season.
Yes, absolutely. There is we are a full symphony orchestra, and that's what's at the core of our existence. And so, for instance, while a season of Haydn and Mozart and Bach and Handel will be lovely, it doesn't employ all of our musicians, and it doesn't show the full panoply of emotional range that the orchestra has. When you have an orchestra of something between 70 or even 80 people sometimes, the sheer sonic impact is absolutely thrilling. But as you say, we have an agreement with our musicians to employ them, and it's a win-win situation because it's who we are.
So one last question for you, Alasdair. As we work on our 21-22 season, which we expect to announce to our public in May this year, and we have been through a time when we've lost a lot of concerts due to the pandemic. We lost a concert or two before that due to various wildfire related situations. So it's been a little bit of a rough patch here in terms of doing what we had set out to do. And I'm just wondering how those canceled concerts and those circumstances play into your thinking as we look forward to the next season.
Well, I would say they play a central part in the thinking for two reasons. These are all very good programs, if I may say so myself, between that you and I put together, and there's no reason just to throw them out because they weren't done at the time we said they were going to do them. They're just as good in 21-22 or 22-23 as they were in 1920. And so related to that, I feel a moral obligation to re-engage the soloists that we were forced to cancel on. And not just because many of them are, in fact, all of them are good friends of mine. It's just the right thing to do. The question will be figuring out their availability and the original program that they would have been part of, and whether that still makes sense. So there will be a little bit of shifting sands and a little bit of fine tuning and mixing around the ingredients. But in the larger sense, I think we can expect to have a lot of those plans come to fruition that we had in place before this all began.
Well, that's great. Well, I'll just say that it's been one of the great pleasures of my work here at the Marin Symphony to get a chance to work with you in creating these programs and get a sense of how you think about it and just how much you bring to that mix. We've only just scratched the surface of that today, but I hope people will find this interesting as I have, and look forward to showing the results of this planning work that we're engaged in to all the people of Marin in just a couple of months.
Well, I just want to throw that back to you, and also thank you for your part in this partnership, because as a musician yourself, I know I can always rely on you to have a great deal of domain expertise, and if an idea that I might have has some kind of flaw in it, you're at liberty to say so, and I will always understand where you're coming from. So you're that rare bird that has the expertise in the administrative side and the musician side as well. So it actually makes, I have to say, our planning process both easy and pleasurable, and then I don't take that for granted.
Great. Well, thank you, and to be continued.
To be continued. Yes, stay tuned. We are working on various scenarios. As you might expect at this stage of the game, it is now nearing the end of February. There are so many unknowns when we look to the fall that we can't say exactly what the situation is going to look like, but we're also flexible and creative. And so I'm confident that whatever it is we come up with, it's going to be a reflection of the organization at its best.
Well, I'm looking forward to that. Alasdair, thank you so much for taking the time to talk about this today. It's been great.
Always a pleasure. Thanks, Tod.
All right. Bye now.
Bye-bye.